Judge Margaret Thornton walked into her courtroom that Tuesday morning with the same confidence she'd carried for 23 years. The Chicago Municipal Court was her domain, and everyone knew it. She'd seen thousands of cases, dealt with countless lawyers, and prided herself on running the tightest courtroom in the building. Nothing surprised her anymore, or so she thought. The morning started like any other. Coffee in her chambers, a quick review of the day's cases, and then the familiar sound of her gavel, calling the court to order. But about 10 minutes into the session, something caught her eye. A kid, couldn't have been more than 17, shuffled through the back doors of the courtroom. And when she said shuffled, she meant it. This teenager looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. He wore a backwards baseball cap, an oversized gray hoodie that practically swallowed him whole, and a pair of beat-up sneakers that had seen better days. Headphones hung around his neck, and he carried a worn notebook under one arm. The judge watched as he slumped into a seat in the back row, spreading out like he was settling in to watch a movie rather than observe legal proceedings. Judge Thornton made a mental note but continued with her work. She figured he was probably there for community service, maybe got caught shoplifting or skipping school too many times. These kids were always getting sent to observe court sessions as some kind of wake-up call. She'd seen it 100 times before. The case that morning was a civil matter. A small bakery owner was being sued by a big real estate company over some lease dispute. Nothing too complicated, or at least that's what the judge thought. The defense attorney was young, probably fresh out of law school, and he seemed nervous. The corporate lawyers on the other side looked like sharks circling wounded prey. As the proceedings went on, Judge Thornton noticed the teenager in the back wasn't sleeping or staring at his phone like most kids would. Instead, he was actually paying attention, scribbling notes in that notebook of his. At first, she thought maybe he was taking this seriously, which would have been refreshing, but then she saw him shake his head a few times, like he disagreed with something being said. When the defense attorney tried to submit some evidence, there was a back and forth about proper procedure. The lawyer stumbled over his words, clearly unsure about the federal rules of evidence. It was a small mistake, nothing major, but it could hurt his case, and that's when it happened. The teenager in the back actually laughed out loud. Not a little chuckle, but a real laugh that echoed through the quiet courtroom. Every head turned. The lawyers paused mid-sentence. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. Judge Thornton felt her blood pressure rise. In 23 years, she'd dealt with disruptions before, but there was something particularly insulting about a kid in a backwards hat, laughing at legal proceedings like they were some kind of joke. She banged her gavel once, hard. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. "Young man," her voice carried the weight of 2 decades of courtroom authority, "approach the bench now." The teenager looked startled, like he'd forgotten where he was for a moment. He stood up slowly, tucking his notebook under his arm, and walked down the aisle. His sneakers squeaked on the polished floor. When he reached the front, he stood there with his hands in his hoodie pockets, looking more annoyed than apologetic. "Would you care to explain," Judge Thornton said, her words sharp and deliberate, "what you find so amusing about my courtroom?" The kid shrugged. "Nothing, Your Honor. It's just that the attorney made a mistake with the evidence rules, and it was kind of obvious, so I just—" "You just what?" The judge leaned forward. "You think you know better than a licensed attorney? You think the law is something to laugh at?" "No, ma'am, I didn't mean—" "Let me tell you something," Judge Thornton interrupted, and she was just getting started. What came next was a 15-minute lecture that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. She talked about respect, about how young people today had no sense of seriousness, about how the legal system wasn't some game or TV show. She told him that if he thought the law was a joke, he'd never amount to anything in life. She questioned what his parents had taught him about respect. She threatened him with contempt of court charges. The teenager's face grew redder with each passing minute. He tried to speak a couple of times, but she cut him off. The lawyers at both tables looked down at their papers, clearly uncomfortable witnessing this public humiliation. The bakery owner in the defendant's chair looked sympathetic, like she felt bad for the kid. Finally, Judge Thornton finished her speech. "Now, you're going to sit down, and you're not going to make another sound for the rest of this proceeding. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Honor," the teenager said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't hear you." "Yes, Your Honor," he repeated, louder this time. "Good. Now sit down." The teenager walked back to his seat, his face burning with embarrassment. He sat down, opened his notebook again, but this time he kept his head down and didn't make eye contact with anyone. Judge Thornton felt satisfied. Another lesson taught. Another young person who'd learned that the courtroom demanded respect. She returned to the case, her authority firmly established, completely unaware that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her judicial career. The morning session continued without further interruption. The kid in the back stayed silent just as she'd ordered. Judge Thornton had no idea that in just a few short hours, everything she thought she knew about that teenager would be turned completely upside down. After the lunch break, Judge Thornton returned to her bench feeling like she'd properly handled the situation with that disruptive teenager. The courtroom settled back into its usual rhythm as they continued with the civil case. But as the afternoon wore on, something started to feel off. The case itself seemed straightforward enough on paper. A woman named Rosa Gutierrez owned a small bakery that had been in the same spot for 15 years. The building had been sold to a massive commercial real estate company about 6 months ago, and now they were suing her for $300,000. They claimed she'd violated her lease terms and wanted her out immediately. Rosa sat at the defense table looking absolutely terrified. She was in her mid-50s with tired eyes and calloused hands from years of kneading dough and working long hours. This bakery wasn't just her business. It was her life, her family's legacy, everything she'd worked for since coming to America. Her lawyer, a guy named Paul Chen, seemed like he meant well, but he was clearly in over his head. Judge Thornton had seen enough attorneys to know when someone was drowning. Paul had only been practicing for about 2 years, and you could tell. He fumbled with his papers, missed obvious objections, and let the corporate lawyers walk all over him. The real estate company had brought in 3 attorneys, all wearing expensive suits and carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Rosa's monthly rent. They were smooth, prepared, and ruthless. They presented witness after witness, each one making Rosa's situation look worse. First came the property inspector who claimed Rosa's bakery had numerous code violations. Electrical problems, plumbing issues, fire hazards. He rattled off a list that made it sound like the building was about to collapse. Paul Chen barely challenged any of it. Then came the accountant who testified about lost rental income. Apparently, the real estate company had several potential tenants ready to pay triple what Rosa was paying. But they couldn't move forward because she wouldn't leave. The numbers kept climbing. $50,000 in lost rent, another $100,000 in renovation costs they couldn't start. Legal fees on top of that. Judge Thornton watched Paul Chen struggle to keep up. He'd object to something, but then couldn't properly explain why. He'd start to cross-examine a witness, then lose his train of thought halfway through. It was painful to watch, honestly. Rosa kept whispering to him frantically, pulling on his sleeve, trying to point things out, but he just kept telling her to stay calm. By mid-afternoon, the case was pretty much over. Anyone watching could see it. The corporate lawyers had built what looked like a solid case, and the defense had barely made a dent in it. Rosa was going to lose her bakery, probably end up in debt for years trying to pay off that $300,000 judgment. During a quick recess, Judge Thornton stepped out for some water. Through the hallway window, she noticed something odd. That teenager from earlier, the one she'd lectured so harshly, was talking to Rosa near the vending machines. He was showing her something in his notebook, pointing at pages and speaking quickly. Rosa's expression changed as she listened. The despair in her eyes started to shift into something else. Hope, maybe? Confusion. The judge couldn't quite tell. When everyone filed back into the courtroom, Rosa raised her hand tentatively. Your Honor, may I say something? Judge Thornton nodded. Go ahead, Mrs. Gutierrez. Rosa stood up, her voice shaking slightly. Your Honor, my attorney Paul has been trying his best, but I think I need more help. Someone just offered to join my defense team, pro bono, for free, and I'd like to accept. The judge raised an eyebrow. Who is this person? Rosa gestured toward the back of the courtroom. Him, the young man back there. Judge Thornton felt her face get hot. She looked at where Rosa was pointing, and sure enough, there was that kid in the hoodie and backwards cap, the same one she'd humiliated in front of everyone just hours ago. Was this some kind of joke? Some kind of revenge prank, Mrs. Gutierrez? The judge said slowly, trying to keep her temper in check. That's not how this works. You can't just bring in random people off the street to represent you in court. The teenager stood up. Your Honor, if I may? You may not, Judge Thornton snapped. Young man, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this court is not a playground. You've already disrupted these proceedings once today. I understand, Your Honor, but I'm actually qualified to help. He reached into his hoodie pocket. Sit down right now, or I'll hold you in contempt. Your Honor, please. His voice was calm, which somehow made the judge even more annoyed. I have my bar card right here. The courtroom went silent. Even the corporate lawyers stopped their whispering. Judge Thornton stared at him. You're what? The teenager walked forward, and this time his steps were more confident. He pulled out a wallet and removed a card, handing it up to the bench. My bar card, Your Honor. I'm a licensed attorney. Judge Thornton took the card like it might bite her. She looked at it closely, then looked at the kid, then back at the card. The name read Thomas Webb. The bar number looked legitimate. The issue date was from California, but there was a recent admission stamp for Illinois. This has to be fake, she muttered. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure. You can verify it. Your Honor, Thomas said. Call the State Bar Association. I'll wait. The corporate lawyers were on their feet immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We object to this disruption. Even if this card is legitimate, which we doubt, allowing new counsel to join mid-trial is... I know the rules, Counselor. Judge Thornton cut them off. She looked at Thomas, really looked at him this time. Behind the casual clothes and young face, there was something in his eyes. A sharpness, a confidence that didn't match his appearance. How old are you? 20, Your Honor. 20. The judge almost laughed. And you're a licensed attorney? Yes, ma'am. I took an accelerated program. Graduated high school early, finished my undergraduate degree in 2 years, and completed law school by 18. I passed the California bar at 19 and was recently admitted here in Illinois. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Thornton held up her hand for silence. This was either the most elaborate prank she'd ever seen, or she'd just made a terrible mistake. Bailiff, get the State Bar Association on the phone now. The next 10 minutes felt like an hour. Thomas stood quietly at the front while the bailiff made the call. The corporate lawyers kept objecting, demanding the proceedings continue, insisting this was all a delay tactic. Paul Chen looked confused but hopeful. Rosa clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Finally, the bailiff hung up and nodded to Judge Thornton. It's legitimate, Your Honor. He's fully licensed and in good standing. Judge Thornton set down the bar card slowly. She looked at Thomas, this kid she'd spent 15 minutes tearing apart earlier, calling him disrespectful and telling him he'd never amount to anything, and he'd been a qualified attorney the entire time. The embarrassment hit her like a wave, but she pushed it down. There'd be time for that later. Very well, she said, her voice tight. Mr. Webb, you may join the defense. Do you need time to review the case? Thomas smiled slightly. No, Your Honor, I've been taking notes all day. I'm ready to proceed. And just like that, everything changed. Thomas took off his backwards cap and set it on the defense table. He pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd been scribbling in all morning, and opened it to reveal pages filled with detailed notes, case citations, and what looked like a complete breakdown of everything that had happened in court. Judge Thornton granted him an hour to confer. With Rosa and Paul Chen, the three of them huddled together at the defense table while the corporate lawyers sat across the aisle, whispering nervously among themselves. They'd gone from confident to concerned in about 5 minutes flat. When court resumed, Thomas stood up for the first time as an attorney, not just an observer. He'd pushed up the sleeves of his hoodie, and somehow even in casual clothes he commanded attention differently now. There was a shift in the air that everyone could feel. Your Honor, Thomas began, his voice clear and steady. I'd like to address several critical issues with the plaintiff's case. Issues that, frankly, should have been caught much earlier. The lead corporate attorney, a man named Richard Sterling with silver hair and a suit that probably cost $5,000, stood up quickly. Your Honor, the plaintiff has already presented substantial evidence. We object to rehashing testimony that's already been given. I'm not rehashing anything, Your Honor, Thomas replied calmly. I'm pointing out that the evidence presented this morning was fundamentally flawed, and in some cases potentially fraudulent. The word fraudulent hung in the air like a bomb. Judge Thornton leaned forward. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Webb. I hope you can back it up. I can, Your Honor. Thomas opened his notebook. Let's start with the lease agreement. The plaintiff claims Mrs. Gutierrez violated multiple terms of her lease. But there's a problem. The lease they submitted as evidence isn't the lease Mrs. Gutierrez signed 15 years ago. Sterling was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is absurd. We have the signed lease right here in evidence. You have a lease, Thomas said, but it's not the original one. He walked over to Rosa, who pulled out a manila folder from her purse. Mrs. Gutierrez kept her original lease agreement. She's had it in a safe deposit box since the day she signed it. Your Honor, if you compare the two documents, you'll see they're different. Judge Thornton had both documents brought to her bench. She read through them carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. The differences were subtle but significant. Clauses had been reworded. Amendment dates had been changed. Terms that Rosa had never agreed to had somehow appeared in the plaintiff's version. Mr. Sterling, the judge said slowly, can you explain these discrepancies? Sterling looked genuinely surprised, which told Thomas that maybe the lawyer himself hadn't known about the doctored documents. Your Honor, I'd need to consult with my client about the document history. You do that, Judge Thornton said, her tone icy. But we're going to continue. Mr. Webb, what else do you have? Thomas flipped through his notes. The property inspector who testified this morning, Daniel Marsh. He claimed he personally inspected Mrs. Gutierrez's bakery on September 15th and found numerous code violations. But there's a problem with that date. And what's that? The judge asked. On September 15th, Mr. Marsh was 300 miles away in Springfield, attending a property management conference. Thomas pulled out printed pages from his notebook. I checked the conference schedule during lunch. Mr. Marsh was a featured speaker. He gave a presentation at 2 in the afternoon, the exact time he claims he was inspecting the bakery here in Chicago. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sterling flipped through his files frantically, looking for something to counter this. Thomas wasn't done. I also have the conference website's photo gallery, Thomas continued, with time-stamped photos showing Mr. Marsh at the event. And here's a credit card receipt from a restaurant in Springfield where he ate dinner that same evening. He handed copies to the judge and the plaintiff's table. Judge Thornton looked at the property inspector, who had gone pale. Mr. Marsh, you're still under oath. Did you personally inspect Mrs. Gutierrez's property on September 15th? The inspector shifted in his seat. Well, Your Honor, I may have gotten the date confused. My assistant might have done the initial inspection, and I reviewed his notes. That's not what you testified to this morning, Thomas said. You specifically said, and I quote from my notes, I personally conducted a thorough inspection. Those were your exact words. I meant that I took responsibility for the inspection. So you lied under oath? Thomas let the question hang there. Sterling jumped up. Your Honor, my witness made an honest mistake about dates. This doesn't invalidate the actual violations found. Thomas turned to face Sterling. Except there's another problem. The violations listed in the report? Most of them are physically impossible for this building. He pulled out more papers from his seemingly endless notebook. The report claims there are electrical code violations in a basement circuit breaker system. Mrs. Gutierrez's building doesn't have a basement. It's built on a concrete slab, which is documented in the original construction permits from 1982. The report mentions a faulty gas line connection to a second-floor unit. The building is only one story, and my personal favorite, it cites improper fire exits in a structure that the fire marshal inspected and approved just 3 months ago. Rosa was crying now, but this time from relief. Paul Chen was frantically writing notes, probably kicking himself for missing all of this. The corporate lawyers were having a heated, whispered conversation at their table. Judge Thornton removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. In 23 years, she'd seen some sloppy legal work, but this was something else entirely. Mr. Webb, please continue. The financial damages are equally problematic, Thomas said, warming to his task. The plaintiff claims they've lost rental income because multiple prospective tenants wanted the space, but couldn't have it due to Mrs. Gutierrez's lease. They've listed 3 specific companies and provided what they call letters of intent from these potential tenants. He paused for effect. I called all 3 companies during lunch break. 2 of them have never heard of this property. The third one confirmed they were approached about renting space, but they turned it down because the asking price was 4 times the market rate. They never submitted any letter of intent. Sterling was sweating now. Your Honor, we need a recess to review our files. There seems to be some confusion with our evidence. Confusion, Thomas repeated. That's an interesting word for it. He looked at his notes one more time. Your Honor, there's a pattern here. Over the past 18 months, this real estate company has filed similar lawsuits against 7 other small business owners in Chicago. All in valuable locations, all with lease agreements that mysteriously developed violations after the buildings were purchased by the plaintiff. And in 6 of those 7 cases, the business owners couldn't afford proper legal representation and simply gave up their leases. Judge Thornton's jaw tightened. Is that true, Mr. Sterling? Sterling loosened his tie. Your Honor, my firm represents the property management company. We file cases based on the information provided to us by our client. If there are issues with that information, we were not aware of them. Well, you're aware now, the judge said. She looked at Thomas with something between respect and disbelief. This kid, this 20-year-old she'd humiliated just hours ago, had just taken apart what looked like a corporate scheme to defraud small business owners. Thomas stood there calmly, still in his hoodie and sneakers, holding a notebook that had just destroyed a $300,000 lawsuit. Your Honor, I move to dismiss all charges against Mrs. Gutierrez with prejudice, and I think this matter needs to be referred to the State Bar Association for investigation. The corporate lawyers huddled together, whispering frantically. Judge Thornton could see them panicking. Their airtight case had become a legal disaster, and now they were facing potential ethics violations. Everything had changed, and it had taken Thomas less than an hour to do it. The corporate lawyers requested an emergency recess. Sterling's face had gone from confident to pale in the span of an hour. Judge Thornton granted them 20 minutes, and the 3 attorneys practically ran out of the courtroom, their phones already pressed to their ears. Rosa grabbed Thomas's hand. Is this real? Are we actually winning? Thomas smiled at her, and for the first time that day he looked his age. We're more than winning, Mrs. Gutierrez, but we're not done yet. Paul Chen approached them, looking embarrassed. I should have caught all of this. I'm sorry, Mrs. Gutierrez, I really let you down. You did your best, Rosa said kindly, though everyone knew it was true that he'd missed everything important. Thomas turned to Paul. You're 2 years into practice, going up against a firm with 50 attorneys and unlimited resources. The system's designed to make cases like this intimidating. That's why they do it. He gestured toward the empty plaintiff's table. They count on small business owners having lawyers who are overworked, underpaid, and overwhelmed. Judge Thornton watched this exchange from her bench. She still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. This kid, this 20-year-old in a hoodie who she'd lectured like a child, had just demonstrated legal skills that most attorneys never developed in entire careers. She felt a knot of shame in her stomach that grew tighter with each passing minute. When the corporate lawyers returned, they looked like they'd aged 5 years. Sterling approached the bench with his 2 colleagues flanking him. Your Honor, we've consulted with our client. They'd like to propose a settlement. Thomas stood up. I'd like to hear this proposal, Your Honor. Sterling cleared his throat. The plaintiff is willing to withdraw the lawsuit in its entirety. No admission of wrongdoing, but we'll drop all claims and Mrs. Gutierrez can continue her lease under the current terms. Thomas didn't even pause. No, everyone looked at him. Rosa tugged on his sleeve. Thomas, that's good, isn't it? I keep my bakery? You deserve better than just keeping what was already yours, Thomas said. He turned to face Sterling. Your client tried to steal this woman's business with fraudulent documents and perjured testimony. They're not going to just walk away clean. Sterling shifted uncomfortably. What are you proposing? Let's start with an apology, Thomas said. A public one in this courtroom on the record. Then we'll talk about a new lease, compensation, and how your client is going to change their business practices. Sterling looked back at his colleagues. They whispered together for a moment. We need to discuss this with our client. Can we have another recess? Judge Thornton had heard enough. No. You can call your client right now from the plaintiff's table. Put them on speaker. I want to hear this conversation. That was unusual, but nobody objected. Sterling pulled out his phone and dialed. A woman's voice answered, sharp and businesslike. What's happening, Richard? I thought this was supposed to be simple. Mrs. Chen, we've encountered some complications. The defense has new counsel who's raised concerns about our evidence. Concerns? What kind of concerns? Thomas spoke up. The kind that involve falsified documents, fabricated inspection reports, and a pattern of predatory lawsuits against small business owners. I'm Thomas Webb, Mrs. Gutierrez's attorney, and I have enough evidence here to refer this case to both the State Bar Association and the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Then, "You're bluffing." "I don't bluff," Thomas said calmly. "I have documented proof that your company has been running this same scheme across Chicago for 18 months. 7 cases, all following the same pattern. I've already started compiling information on the other 6 victims. By tomorrow morning, I could have complaints filed with multiple agencies." More silence. Judge Thornton found herself almost enjoying this. "The kid had guts. What do you want?" Mrs. Chen finally asked. Thomas walked closer to the phone. "First, you're going to give Mrs. Gutierrez a new 20-year lease at her current rate, with a clause that limits rent increases to no more than 2% annually. Second, you're going to pay her $50,000 for her legal fees, emotional distress, and lost business from dealing with this lawsuit. Third, you're going to issue a public apology. And fourth, you're going to sign an agreement promising to stop these predatory practices and to offer fair settlements to the other 6 business owners you've targeted." "That's insane. We're not admitting to anything." Thomas picked up his notebook. "Then I'll see you in criminal court. I'm sure the media will be very interested in this story. Major real estate company accused of systematic fraud against small business owners. That's a headline that'll look great next to your company's name." Rosa was staring at Thomas like he'd grown a second head. Paul Chen was scribbling notes so fast his hand was probably cramping. Judge Thornton realized she was leaning forward in her seat, completely absorbed. "You can't prove criminal intent," Mrs. Chen said, but her voice had lost its edge. "Maybe not beyond reasonable doubt," Thomas admitted, "but I don't need to. Civil court has a lower standard of proof, and even if I only win half of what I'm claiming, the publicity alone will destroy your company's reputation. Plus 6 other angry business owners who now know they have a case. Your legal bills will be astronomical." He paused to let that sink in. "Or you can settle now. Pay Mrs. Gutierrez fairly, make things right with the others, and change how you do business. Your choice." The phone was quiet for so long that Sterling checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, Mrs. Chen spoke. "$10,000, a 5-year lease extension, and we withdraw the suit." "That's my counteroffer." "Not even close," Thomas said. $50,000, 20 years, and the apology. Non-negotiable. $25,000, 10 years. Thomas looked at Rosa. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to keep going. $40,000, 15 years, and you still apologize and make things right with the other business owners. Another long pause. $35,000, 15 years, written apology. That's my final offer. Thomas turned to Rosa and whispered, "It's your decision, but I think we can push for more." Rosa whispered back, 15 years is more than I dreamed of this morning. And 35,000? That's more money than I've saved in my life. Take it. Thomas straightened up. We have one more condition. The apology needs to be public and on the record in this court, and the agreement to settle with the other business owners needs to be in writing with specific terms, not just a vague promise. Fine, Mrs. Chen said, sounding exhausted. Draw up the settlement agreement. We'll sign it. Sterling ended the call and looked at Thomas with something that might have been respect. I'll have the documents prepared by tomorrow morning. Tonight, Thomas said. We'll review them tonight and sign tomorrow morning if everything's in order. Mrs. Gutierrez has been through enough. She deserves to sleep well tonight knowing this is really over. Judge Thornton banged her gavel, but softly this time. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 to finalize the settlement. Mr. Webb, excellent work. She paused, the words catching in her throat. Truly exceptional. As people started gathering their belongings, Judge Thornton called out, Mr. Webb, can you approach the bench, please? Thomas walked up, and for the first time since revealing he was an attorney, he looked a little nervous. Judge Thornton took a deep breath. It was time to do something she rarely did. It was time to admit she'd been completely wrong. Thomas stood at the bench, his notebook still clutched in his hand. The courtroom had mostly cleared out, just a few people lingering near the back. Rosa was outside in the hallway, probably calling her family to share the news. Judge Thornton looked down at this young man, really seeing him for the first time. Mr. Webb, she began, then stopped. This was harder than she'd expected. Thomas, I owe you an apology. Thomas shifted his weight but didn't interrupt. This morning I judged you entirely on your appearance. I saw a teenager in a hoodie and a backwards cap, and I made assumptions. Terrible assumptions. She set down her gavel, a gesture that felt symbolic somehow. I lectured you about respect, about never amounting to anything, about not understanding the law. And the entire time, you were a licensed attorney who understood this case better than anyone else in the room, including me. Your Honor, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She cut him off gently. In 23 years on this bench, I've prided myself on being fair. On judging cases based on facts and evidence, not on appearances or assumptions. But today I failed at that completely. I humiliated you in front of a courtroom full of people because of how you looked, not because of anything you actually did wrong. Thomas finally spoke. You weren't entirely wrong, Your Honor. I was laughing, which was disrespectful. And I probably should dress more professionally when I'm observing court. No, Judge Thornton said firmly. You were reacting to a legitimate legal error. And as for your clothes, she almost smiled. You're a licensed attorney in good standing. You can wear whatever you want, as long as it meets the court's basic requirements. I had no right to shame you for it. She leaned back in her chair. Can I ask you something? Why do you dress that way? You clearly know how to navigate the legal system. You could fit in with the Sterling types if you wanted to. Thomas thought about it for a moment. That's exactly why I don't. People like Sterling, they've made the law feel like a private club. Expensive suits, fancy offices, Latin phrases that normal people don't understand. They've built walls around justice and convinced everyone that you need money and connections to get through. He gestured at his hoodie. When I dress like this, I'm making a point. The law shouldn't belong to people who can afford $1,000 suits. It should belong to everyone. People like Mrs. Gutierrez should be able to look at an attorney and think, that's someone who might help me, not, that's someone I could never afford. Judge Thornton nodded slowly. That's admirable. But doesn't it make your job harder? People underestimating you? Sometimes, Thomas admitted. But it also makes people show their true colors faster. Like this morning. If I'd walked in here wearing a three-piece suit, you probably would have been polite to me. Maybe you would have still disagreed with my reaction. But you wouldn't have given me that lecture. The hoodie and the cap made you feel like you could talk down to me. The words stung because they were true. Judge Thornton had felt superior to him, had felt justified in her harsh words, all because of his appearance. You're right, she said quietly, and I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Thomas nodded, accepting the apology. Can I ask you something now, Your Honor? Of course. Why did you become a judge? The question caught her off guard. To uphold justice. To make sure the law was applied fairly. And do you think what happened to Mrs. Gutierrez was fair? Her first attorney was overmatched. If I hadn't been here by coincidence, she would have lost everything today. Not because she was wrong, but because she couldn't afford better representation. Judge Thornton felt the weight of his words. No, it wasn't fair. That happens every single day in courtrooms across the country, Thomas said. People lose cases they should win because they can't afford attorneys who have the time and resources to fight properly. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. It's just designed to favor people with money. So what's the solution? The judge asked. Thomas smiled, and it made him look even younger. I'm still figuring that out. That's why I took a break from my old firm. I was making great money, working on corporate cases, and I was miserable. I kept thinking about all the people who needed help and couldn't get it. Is that why you were here today? Looking for cases like this? Sort of. I've been visiting different courtrooms, watching how things work, trying to understand where the gaps are. When I saw Mrs. Gutierrez this morning and realized what was happening, I knew I had to help. He paused. Even though you'd just finished telling me I'd never amount to anything. Judge Thornton winced. I really did say that, didn't I? You did. But you know what? It lit a fire under me, made me want to prove you wrong. He grinned. So maybe in a weird way it helped. They both laughed, breaking the tension. Judge Thornton stood up and extended her hand. Thomas shook it. What's next for you? She asked. I'm thinking about starting a small practice. Nothing fancy. Maybe just me in a small office, taking cases like Mrs. Gutierrez's, people who need help but can't afford the big firms. You'd be giving up a lot of money. Money's not why I became a lawyer, Thomas said. I wanted to help people. Turns out that's a lot harder than passing the bar exam. The next morning, Thomas returned to court in the same hoodie and backwards cap. The settlement documents were signed. Rosa got her 15-year lease, her $35,000, and a written apology from the real estate company. The other 6 business owners were also offered fair settlements. Judge Thornton watched Thomas work, and when it was all finished, she did something unusual. She asked him if he'd be interested in taking court-appointed cases in her courtroom, cases where defendants needed representation but couldn't afford it. Thomas agreed immediately. Over the next few months, Thomas became a regular presence in Judge Thornton's court. He still wore hoodies and sneakers. He still looked more like a college student than an attorney. But everyone who saw him work quickly learned not to judge him by his appearance. Rosa's bakery thrived. She started sending pastries to Thomas's new office every week, which he shared with clients who couldn't afford to take time off work for long meetings. Judge Thornton kept a newspaper clipping on her desk from the day the story broke about the real estate company's scheme. Thomas was in the photo, wearing his signature backwards cap, standing next to Rosa outside the courthouse. Under the clipping, Judge Thornton had written a note to herself in pen. Justice should never depend on appearance, age, or assumptions. Judge the argument, not the attorney. She'd learned her lesson the hard way, but she'd learned it well. And every time a young person entered her courtroom, every time someone showed up in casual clothes or looked out of place, she remembered the day she'd humiliated a teenager who turned out to be one of the best attorneys she'd ever seen. Thomas had changed her courtroom, but more importantly, he'd changed her perspective. And in the end, that might have been his greatest victory of all.